The briefing room went dead silent. Not because of the mission, not because of the target, because of her. 5'3". Mechanic coveralls, no oshu, no medals on her chest, no calluses from a battlefield, or so they thought. The commander looked at her file, then he closed it. I asked for America's best sniper, he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Not a woman who repairs rifles. A few soldiers laughed. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't say a word. And that silence was the most dangerous thing in the room. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and stay until the end. Because what happens next, nobody saw coming. The coffee in the briefing room had gone cold an hour ago. Nobody touched it. The 12 men sitting around the reinforced steel table weren't the kind of men who noticed small things like temperature. They noticed threats. They noticed terrain elevation and wind direction, and the difference between a 7.62 NATO round and a .338 Lapua at 800 meters. They noticed everything, except apparently that the woman who had quietly slipped into the back of the room 20 minutes ago had been listening to every word they said. Commander Ethan Cross stood at the head of the table, arms folded, jaw tight. He was 41 years old, former Delta, 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, and 1 in Syria that the public record didn't acknowledge. His face had the kind of permanent squint that came from spending too many years looking through scopes in bright desert sun. He didn't pace when he was tense. He went still, like a dog that had already decided whether to bite. 8 days, he said. I've been waiting 8 days for confirmation. Colonel Marcus Vale, seated to his left, Pentagon liaison, silver-haired and perpetually undercaffeinated, slid a manila folder across the table without making eye contact. Ethan looked at it. He didn't open it immediately. He had learned, over 20 years, that the worst news always came in the thinnest folders. This one was thin. He opened it. The photograph clipped to the inside cover showed a woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back, sharp eyes, no expression that gave anything away. Below the photo, a name, a rank, a service record that was, oddly, only 2 pages long. Staff Sergeant Maya Reeves. Ethan read the file once, then he read it again, slower, because the first pass didn't make sense. No combat deployments listed, no confirmed kills, no active sniper certification on record. Previous assignment, weapons maintenance and repair, 10th Mountain Division. Before that, marksmanship instructor, classified facility, duration unspecified. He turned the page, found nothing, turned it back. This is the shooter? He said. That's the shooter, Vale said. Ethan set the folder down with a quiet, controlled movement that somehow conveyed more contempt than slamming it would have. Marcus, with respect. The mission profile calls for a confirmed 3,000-meter engagement. We're not talking about a controlled range shot. We're talking about a moving target, high altitude, unpredictable crosswind, 1 window of exposure, maybe 30 seconds. The last 3 snipers who attempted this distance in live conditions, I know what the mission calls for. 2 of them missed. 1 of them caught a ricochet fragment and spent 3 months in Walter Reed. Ethan tapped the folder. And you're sending me this? She came recommended. By who? Vale looked at his coffee cup. That part's classified. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the base was already active. The distant hum of a C-130 on the tarmac, the muted crack of the firing range 3 buildings over, someone running hard on the gravel path that ran alongside the east fence. Normal sounds. Mission sounds. Then the door behind Ethan opened. He didn't turn around immediately. He was still looking at the file, and something about the timing made him wait. Some instinct, some leftover combat reflex that said, don't react until you know what you're reacting to. The person who entered made almost no sound, not the deliberate silence of someone trying to be quiet, the natural silence of someone who moved like that without thinking about it. Ethan finally turned. She was smaller than the photograph made her look. That was the first thing. Not fragile. There was nothing fragile about the way she stood, but compact. The way certain tools were compact. Built for function, not appearance. She wore olive mechanic coveralls that were a size too large at the shoulders. No rank insignia visible, No decorations. A single rifle case in her left hand, black and unmarked, which she set down beside the door with the kind of practiced care you gave something irreplaceable. She didn't introduce herself. She just stood there and let the room look at her. The room looked. Sergeant First Class Dennis Hooper, seated near the back, 11 years Special Forces, the kind of man who laughed at things that weren't funny because laughing made him feel like he was still in control, leaned toward the man beside him. "Maybe she's here to repair the sniper's rifle," he murmured, "after the real one arrives." The man beside him, Corporal Tate, younger, still learning what was acceptable to laugh at in this room, laughed. Not loud, but enough. Maya heard it. Everyone could tell she heard it by the way she didn't react, the deliberate absence of reaction. She simply stood at the edge of the room with her hands relaxed at her sides and her eyes moving slowly across the table, reading each face the way you'd read terrain. Cataloging. Ethan crossed the room toward her. He was taller by nearly a foot. He used that without thinking about it, the way tall men sometimes did, positioning himself so the height difference registered. "Staff Sergeant Reeves." "Sir." Her voice was even. Not flat, even. Like she'd learned somewhere along the way that giving people nothing to react to was its own kind of armor. "I've read your file," Ethan said. "Yes, sir." "It's short." "Yes, sir." "Your last deployment was—" He glanced back at the table, at the folder. "Maintenance. Weapons repair. That's what the file says." Something about the way she said it made Hooper straighten slightly. Not the words. The way she said file. Like the file was a separate object from the truth, and she was simply acknowledging the existence of the object. Ethan didn't miss it. He filed it away. "You understand what this mission requires?" "I read the brief on the flight in. A 3,247-meter shot, under live conditions, one window." "I understand." "Against a target who has survived 3 previous interdiction attempts." "I read the brief." Ethan studied her for a moment. There was a particular kind of confidence he recognized. The loud kind. The kind that filled rooms, the kind that men like Hooper wore like a uniform. And then there was this other kind, the kind that didn't fill anything, that just existed, quietly, like bedrock under snow. He didn't know what to do with that yet. So he did what men like him did when they didn't know what to do. He pushed. "You understand," he said, more slowly now, making sure the room could hear, "that this mission requires someone who can pull a trigger under pressure, not someone who knows how to clean one." The silence that followed was a specific kind, the held breath kind. Hooper's mouth curved slightly at the corner. Corporal Tate looked at the floor. Vale, at the far end of the table, kept his eyes on his coffee. Maya looked at Ethan Cross. Not up at him, though she had to, given the height difference. She looked at him the way a person looked at something they were measuring. Precise. Unhurried. "I heard you, sir," she said. And then she walked to the far end of the table and sat down. Not dismissed, not deferring, done with that part of the conversation. Ethan stood where he was for a half-second longer than was comfortable. Then he turned back to the mission board. Vale gave the full debrief. Target, Khalid Nazari. Former military engineer recruited by a network that the Pentagon's public briefings referred to as a regional destabilization asset, and that everyone in this room understood meant something considerably darker. Nazari was responsible, directly or by authorization, for the deaths of 37 coalition personnel over 4 years. 2 attempted captures had ended in firefights with heavy casualties on both sides. 1 assassination attempt had reached within 60 meters of Nazari before the asset was compromised and executed. He moved between 3 compound locations in a mountain region where drone coverage was compromised by terrain and electronic jamming. He appeared in the open, briefly, predictably, once or twice a week, at a specific compound during daylight hours, during a window that lasted approximately 25 seconds. The distance from the only viable firing position to that appearance point, 3,247 meters. The previous 2 attempts, Vale said, clicking through the tactical slides, were made by operators with confirmed long-range records. Both shots missed. Wind variance at altitude made the calculations unstable. He paused. We need someone who can compensate in real time, not just calculate, feel. And you think she can feel it, Ethan said. Not a question, more of an audit. I think you should let her demonstrate, Vale said carefully. Before deciding what she can or can't do. Ethan looked at Maya. She was studying the topographic overlay on the mission board. Her eyes moved from the elevation markings to the wind data to the compound layout in a sequence that looked, to him, watching, like she was doing calculations. Fast ones. Tomorrow morning, Ethan said. Range qualification. 0500. He let the words drop flat. You get one attempt to demonstrate you belong on this team. Maya didn't look away from the board. What's the distance? We'll start at 1,500. And the wind conditions? Ethan paused. Mountain terrain? Natural exposure. Now she looked at him. What's the full range? A beat. You'll find out when you get there. She held his gaze for a moment, then returned to the board. Nobody said anything. That night, the base settled into the specific quiet of a facility that was never entirely quiet. Generators humming, guards rotating, the occasional sharp radio crackle from the operations center down the hall. Maya was in the equipment bay. The Barrett M107 was disassembled on the work table in front of her. She wasn't cleaning it. It had arrived clean. She was learning it. The specific tolerances of this rifle, the trigger pull weight, which was fractionally heavier than the model spec suggested, the scope mount, which had a hairline variance she could feel with her thumbnail but couldn't see, the bolt, which cycled smooth but had a faint resistance at the chamber point that told her the barrel had seen significant use. She didn't write any of this down. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, quietly, completely, without ceremony. The door to the equipment bay opened. She didn't look up. You're going to be here all night, said a voice. Corporal Danny Tate stood in the doorway. He was 26, she estimated, knew enough to the unit that he still defaulted to following the room's lead, which was why he'd laughed earlier, old enough to feel bad about it afterward, which was why he was here now. Probably, Maya said. He came in anyway. Stood on the other side of the table looking at the disassembled rifle with the particular reverence of someone who respected the machinery even if he didn't fully understand it. Barrett .50, he said. M107, A1. She picked up the suppressor housing, examined the threading, set it down. Heavier than the standard configuration. Somebody had aftermarket work done on the rail system. Is that a problem? Just information. Tate was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, don't, Maya said. He blinked. I wasn't. You were going to apologize for laughing, she said. Don't. It's done. It doesn't matter. It matters. She set down the component she was holding and looked at him for the first time since he'd entered. Why are you here, Corporal? He thought about it, the honest version. I wanted to see what you were doing. Now you've seen. Can I stay? She looked at him for another moment, that same measuring quality, the same unhurried assessment, and then she turned back to the rifle. Close the door, she said. He did. 0447 hours. The mountain range to the east was just beginning to resolve itself out of darkness, edges sharpening against a sky that was moving from black to the specific cold blue that came before dawn. The temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind at range level was coming from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour, gusting to 19. Maya was already at the firing line. She'd been there for 20 minutes, long enough to let her body temperature equalize with the environment, long enough to feel how the wind moved in this specific corridor, not just the raw speed, but the pattern, the way it compressed between the ridgelines to the north and accelerated in 3-second intervals before backing off. The way it shifted 4 degrees clockwise when it gusted. She had the Barrett in position, bipod down, suppressor on, a ballistic data card taped to the stock that she'd written herself the night before, accounting for the specific rifle's variants. Ethan Cross arrived at 0500 on the 2nd. With him came 6 members of the team. Some of them had been in the briefing room, some were new. All of them had the posture of people expecting to be entertained. Sergeant Hooper walked to the range monitor stand, picked up a set of binoculars, and said, loud enough to carry, I give her 6 rounds before she starts blaming the equipment. Someone chuckled. Ethan said nothing. He stood with his own binoculars and watched Maya with an expression that had locked down into professional neutrality, the kind of neutral that was doing a lot of work underneath. Range is hot, the range operator called. Initial target at 1,500 meters, standard silhouette. Maya settled her breathing. She had a particular way of going still that wasn't the stillness of tension. It was the stillness of release. Every unnecessary thing in her body went quiet. Her heartbeat slowed by conscious effort. Her breathing found a rhythm that worked around the natural pause between exhale and the next inhale, the space where the body was most stable, where the crosshairs held truest. She fired. The Barrett's report punched through the cold air like a physical object. Through the range monitor, the target showed a hit, dead center, upper thoracic region. Nobody said anything. She fired again, same location. Again. By the 5th round, Hooper had stopped making comments. He had the binoculars to his eyes and he was very still. By the 8th round, the range operator was leaning forward over his console. By the 10th round, Ethan Cross lowered his binoculars slowly, the way a man lowered something heavy. The grouping on the target was difficult to look at and immediately process. 10 rounds. Standard silhouette at 1,500 meters. The grouping diameter was smaller than a playing card, not because each shot had been perfect, but because each shot had been the same. Like she'd fired the same shot 10 times. The range was silent, not the polite silence of people being careful with their words, the actual silence of people who had run out of them. Ethan turned to the range operator. Activate the moving target. The range operator looked at him. Commander, that's not... Activate it. The man hit the switch. 600 meters out, a motorized silhouette track engaged. The target began moving across a lateral corridor, left to right, variable speed, programmed to shift direction without warning. It was an evaluation tool, but a specific one. They used it for advanced qualification, for operators who were testing for urban engagement certification. Nobody had told Maya it existed. She watched it for 3 seconds. Then she adjusted. Not dramatically. A small correction to the scope, a shift of her body position, realigning her natural point of aim with the target's anticipated trajectory. Her breathing pattern changed. She was leading now, not tracking. The target shifted speed. Maya adjusted again, shifted direction. She adjusted again. Fired. The bullet traveled the distance in just over half a second. The target's frame registered the impact. Dead center. The range operator actually stood up. Hooper put the binoculars down. Ethan Cross stared through his own glass for a long time without moving. Behind him, someone said quietly, not mockingly, just genuinely, Jesus. Maya ejected the spent casing. It hit the frozen ground with a sound that seemed very loud in the silence. She kept her eye on the target corridor, running one more quick check of the scope, cataloging the wind shift that had happened mid-shot, filing it against the result. Ethan walked toward her. She heard him coming. She stayed where she was, not to make a point, but because there was still a round chambered, and she wasn't the kind of person who stood up with a chambered round. He stopped a few feet away. She ejected the round, cleared the breech, engaged the safety. Then she stood and looked at him. He was looking at the rifle. Something in his face had changed. The neutrality was still there, but it had cracks in it now, and through the cracks she could see something she recognized from a lifetime of watching people process information they hadn't been prepared for. He looked up at her. Quite a toy, he said. For a technician. She held his gaze. That's a Barrett M107A1, she said. Her voice was the same, even, unhurried, but there was something in it now, a line that hadn't been there before, a firmness. It has a muzzle energy of approximately 14,000 foot-pounds. It can punch through half an inch of rolled steel at 1,000 meters. She paused. It is not a toy, sir. He said nothing. And I'm not here because of who my father was, she continued. I'm not here because somebody owed somebody a favor. I'm not here because the Pentagon needed to fill a diversity quota on a classified mission brief. The range was very quiet. "I'm here," she said, "because I earned this." She picked up the Barrett case, broke the rifle down in a sequence that took approximately 40 seconds. Components nestled, latches closed, case lifted. She turned and walked toward the equipment building. Behind her, the team stood on the frozen range in the early light, watching her go. Ethan Cross stood at the front of them. His binoculars were at his side. His face had gone through something in the past 10 minutes, some interior reckoning, and the result hadn't finished yet. He was still processing. He would think, later, that was the moment he should have recognized what he was dealing with, that the test designed to break her had broken exactly the wrong thing. He didn't know yet. None of them did. What the mission would actually require, what the mountains would take from them, what it would cost to reach a firing position that had never been successfully reached, against a target that had survived everything the U.S. military had sent at him. He didn't know that in 72 hours, the careful tactical plan he had spent 8 days constructing would be worthless. He didn't know that the woman they had called a technician, the woman they'd invited to fail on a frozen range before breakfast, would be the only reason any of them made it back. He didn't know any of that yet. But Hooper, standing at the edge of the range with his binoculars hanging loose from one hand, turned to Tate beside him and said quietly, with the specific tone of a man updating a calculation, "She's going to be a problem." He meant it, still, in the wrong way. He would figure out the right way later. At 6:12, Ethan Cross walked into Vale's office, closed the door, and sat down across the desk. Vale didn't say anything. He waited. "Her range records," Ethan said. "The real ones." "Classified," Vale said. "Unclassify them." Vale looked at him for a moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and placed a second folder on the surface. This one was thicker than the one from the briefing, much thicker. Ethan opened it. He read for 11 minutes without looking up. When he finally closed it, he sat very still for a moment. The kind of still he went when things landed on him that he needed time to arrange. 6 years, he said. 6 years, Vale confirmed. Classified facility. No public record. Ethan looked at the folder. Why? Because the program she was part of doesn't officially exist, Vale said, and because she asked them to keep it that way. She asked... Ethan stopped. She didn't want the record, Vale said simply. She wanted to be sent somewhere she'd actually be needed. He paused. She's been waiting for this mission for 2 years, Ethan. She submitted a request through the program office 17 months ago, specifically identifying Nazari as a viable target given the compound's terrain profile. Another pause. The shot geometry was her idea. Ethan Cross sat in the chair across from Marcus Vale and looked at a wall that wasn't showing him anything useful. Outside, the base was fully awake now. The range was still. The C-13... Oh, that had been on the tarmac when the day started, had taxied away. Somewhere across the compound, in an equipment bay, a woman was reassembling a .50 caliber rifle with the same meticulous care she had given it last night and the night before, and presumably every night for 6 years in a facility that didn't exist. I need to apologize to her, Ethan said. Vale was quiet for a moment. That's your decision. It's the right thing to do. Probably. She won't want it, Ethan said. Almost certainly not, Vale agreed. Ethan stood, picked up the classified folder, handed it back. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. The mission brief says 72 hours to insertion, he said. Correct. What are our extraction protocols if the primary route is compromised? Vale's expression shifted slightly, in a way that meant he had been waiting for this question and hoping it wouldn't come. There are contingencies. I want to see them. Ethan. All of them, Marcus. He looked at the man across the desk. Because whoever designed that shot geometry was looking at the same terrain I've been looking at. And if she saw what I see... He stopped, jaw tight. Get me the extraction contingencies. He left. The door didn't quite close all the way behind him, and in the growing light of the mountain morning, somewhere across Fort Langley's compound, the Barrett M107A1, tool, instrument, machine built for a single precise purpose, was being reassembled by hands that knew it better than its manufacturer had intended. The mission was in 72 hours. And Commander Ethan Cross, walking through the cold toward an apology he wasn't sure he deserved to give, was only now beginning to understand that the most dangerous thing on this operation wasn't the 3,247-meter shot. It was the fact that the woman he had underestimated had already been planning this for 2 years, and she had planned for everything, except what came next. The extraction contingency files were still open on Ethan's desk when the first problem arrived. It came in the form of Sergeant First Class Dennis Hooper, who knocked twice on the doorframe of the operations room at 0831 hours and entered without waiting for an answer, which was either a habit or a statement, and with Hooper, the line between the two had always been thin. "We need to talk about the team configuration," Hooper said. Ethan didn't look up from the topographic overlay spread across the table. "Sit down, Dennis." "I'd rather stand." "I'd rather you sat." Hooper sat. He had the posture of a man who sat the way some people argued, leaning forward, elbows on knees, the physical language of someone who had already decided the conversation was going to go his way and was simply waiting for the other person to figure that out. "The team's not comfortable," Hooper said. "The team's never comfortable. That's not a new condition." "You know what I mean." Ethan finally looked up. "Say it plainly." Hooper's jaw worked for a second. Not hesitation, he was choosing words, which was a different thing. "She cleared the range. Nobody's disputing that. Static targets, moving target, the whole sequence. She shot clean." He paused. "But a range is a controlled environment. The mountain's not a range. We've got altitude variables, thermal layering, unpredictable crosswind channels between the ridges. I've seen marksmen with 3 combat tours behind them freeze up when the real thing hits them sideways." "And your conclusion is?" "My conclusion is we don't know what she does when things go wrong, when the conditions aren't optimal. When somebody's shooting back." Hooper's voice was steady, careful. He'd rehearsed this. "You've built a mission around a shooter with no combat record, Commander. And I'm sitting here telling you that the men on this team have families, and I have to be able to look them in the eye and tell them the plan is sound." Ethan held Hooper's gaze for a long moment. Outside the ops room, the base moved through its morning rhythms. Someone was running equipment checks on the vehicle pool. A radio crackled twice and went quiet. Normal sounds. The sounds of a mission that hadn't started going wrong yet. "Her range records," Ethan said carefully, "are classified above your clearance level." "I know that. What I can tell you is that what you saw this morning was not the ceiling of her capability." He let that sit for a second. "It was closer to the floor." Hooper looked at him. "That's all I can give you," Ethan said. "You want more than that. You talk to Colonel Vale and you ask him to bump your clearance. That process takes about 6 weeks. He looked back at the topographic overlay. "We insert in 68 hours. So." Hooper sat with that. He had the particular expression of a man who had come into a room expecting to win an argument and discovered that the argument had already been settled without him. He stood, got halfway to the door. "For the record," he said, "I still think this is a mistake." "Your objection is noted," Ethan said. "Close the door on your way out." The door closed. Ethan stared at the topographic overlay for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he picked up the radio handset on the corner of the desk. "Reeves," he said. "Operations room, 10 minutes. The handset crackled. "Copy." Her voice on the radio was the same as her voice in person. Even. Unhurried. Like she'd been awake for hours and was fine with it, which she probably had been and was. She arrived in 9 minutes. She was wearing the same coveralls, or a different pair of the same coveralls. He couldn't tell. She had a small notebook tucked into her left breast pocket, the spiral-bound kind, edges worn from handling. She stood in the doorway the same way she'd stood in the briefing room the day before, not filling it, not shrinking from it, just occupying it with the specific density of someone who didn't waste energy on presentation. "Close the door," Ethan said. She did. He gestured at the topographic overlay. "Come look at this." She came around the table and stood beside him, close enough that he was aware of the cold she'd brought in from outside, the faint smell of solvent from the equipment bay. She looked at the map. He watched her look at it. The way her eyes moved, not scanning randomly, but working a specific sequence, starting at the insertion point, moving along the approach route, finding the elevation markers on the ridgeline, locating the firing position. "You've seen this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes had moved too directly, without the hesitation of someone orienting themselves to new terrain. I've seen the satellite imaging, she said, and the topographic data from the previous attempts. Different format, same terrain. When? 17 months ago. She pointed to a ridgeline northeast of the compound. The previous teams used this approach. Both of them. Her finger moved slightly. This is the problem. The final 400 meters before the firing position runs along a lateral shelf, here, that's exposed to the compound's eastern observation post for approximately 12 minutes of travel time. Both teams had to move fast and low, which meant they arrived at the firing position compromised. Elevated heart rate, disrupted breathing, no settling time. Ethan looked at where her finger was resting. You've identified an alternate approach, he said. I submitted it 17 months ago. Show me. She moved her finger northwest. There's a dry drainage channel here. It runs from this ridge line, she traced it, down to approximately 200 meters north of the firing position. It's longer, adds roughly 4 hours to the approach, but it keeps the team below the observation post sightlines for the entire final section. She paused. The previous mission planners rejected it because of the time cost. 4 hours is significant. 4 hours is the difference between arriving ready and arriving compromised. She looked at him. The shot window is 25 seconds. If the shooter's heart rate is elevated when that window opens, it doesn't matter how good they are. The shot geometry requires a stable base, physiologically stable, not just mechanically. Ethan studied the drainage channel route. It was there on the map. He'd seen it before but dismissed it, or someone in the planning chain had dismissed it. A thin line running through what looked on paper like impassable terrain. You've assessed the drainage channel's trafficability? It's passable for a 6-person team with standard mountain kit. There's a section here, she pointed, approximately 300 meters that requires technical climbing. Class 3. Nothing that needs specialized equipment if the team is current on mountain operations. They're current, Ethan said. Then it's viable. He stood back from the map, crossed his arms, looked at her instead of the terrain for a moment, which was a different kind of assessment. Why didn't you lead with this yesterday? He said. In the briefing. You'd been thinking about this for 17 months. Why wait? She met his eyes. Because yesterday, the question wasn't whether my plan was good. The question was whether I was allowed to have one. A beat. I've learned to answer the questions people are actually asking before I try to answer the ones they should be. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the map. I'll need a full route breakdown, he said. Pace counts, waypoints, contingency decision points. I want it by 1600. It'll be ready by 1400. 1400 then. She turned to leave. Reeves. She stopped. He had the folder on the corner of the table, the thick one Vale had given him. He hadn't put it away. He'd been looking at it on and off since 0612, reading sections of it, trying to square what was in it with the woman who had stood at the firing line that morning and shot a grouping he'd never seen outside of a controlled facility with ideal conditions. He didn't pick it up, didn't reference it directly. The program you were part of, he said. 6 years, the facility. She waited. Whose decision was it to keep it off the record? She looked at him for a moment, and he got the sense, not for the first time, that she was making a real-time assessment of exactly how much to give him. Not lying, not deflecting, calculating the appropriate unit of truth for the conversation. Mine, she said. Why? Because if it was on the record, people would know what I could do before I arrived. And then the first conversation is always about the record instead of the mission. She paused. I'd rather they underestimate me. It's easier to work that way. Easier, he repeated. People who underestimate you leave gaps, she said simply. I've learned to work in the gaps. She left. The door closed quietly behind her. Ethan Cross stood at the topographic table and looked at a drainage channel route that had been submitted 17 months ago and rejected by people who had probably been very confident in their rejection. He picked up the radio. Vale, operations room, now. The team briefing was at 1300. Tate arrived 2 minutes early and sat near the back, which was where he'd been sitting since the range that morning, as if proximity to the room's rear wall gave him some protection from the reconfiguration happening in his understanding of things. Hooper arrived exactly on time, which with Hooper meant 30 seconds early, and sat in his usual chair, front left, position of casual authority, and did not look at the doorway when Maya came in. She came in last, which Ethan had not orchestrated, but which had the effect of every head turning as she entered. She was carrying the notebook. She set it on the table in front of her, which was a different position than yesterday. Not the edge, but the center, because Ethan had put her there. He opened the briefing without preamble. "Route change," he said. "Primary approach is scrapped. We're moving to an alternate insertion through the northern drainage channel. Adds 4 hours to the approach timeline. Insertion moves up 6 hours to compensate." He clicked to a new slide on the mission board. Staff Sergeant Reeves identified the route and will lead the tactical navigation for the final section. The room processed this. Hooper's face did something complicated and then went neutral. Sergeant Vasquez, quiet, competent, 8 years in, the kind of operator who formed opinions slowly and held them seriously, leaned forward and looked at the map overlay. "The drainage channel. That's Class 3 terrain in the upper section." "Correct," Maya said. "The team is current on mountain operations per your qualification records. It's manageable." Vasquez looked at her. Not hostile, evaluating. "Who's done the pace count?" "I have. Based on satellite elevation data and comparative terrain analysis from 2 analogous drainage systems in the same mountain range." She opened the notebook and slid it across the table toward him. "Full waypoint breakdown is on page 2. Contingency decision points are marked in red." Vasquez took the notebook. He looked at it with the specific attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. After about 30 seconds, he looked up. "These contingency points, if we blow the timeline at waypoint 4, then we have 2 options," Maya said. "We can push to the alternate rest position here," she reached across and pointed at the map, "and recalculate the insertion window, or we abort to the secondary extraction corridor and request a new mission window. I built a decision matrix for each scenario. It's on page 4. Vasquez looked at page 4. A long moment. He nodded slowly. Not effusively. The nod of someone who had expected to find problems and found fewer than anticipated. "I've got questions about the thermal layering effect on ballistics at that elevation," he said. "I've accounted for it," Maya said. "The Barrett's performance data at altitude is well documented. The specific compound is at 2,400 meters. At that elevation, reduced air density increases projectile velocity by approximately 3%, but also increases drift sensitivity in crosswind conditions. The firing solution accounts for both." Hooper hadn't spoken since the briefing started. He was looking at the mission board with his arms crossed, the posture of a man in disagreement with something he hadn't yet found the exact words to articulate. "Dennis," Ethan said. Hooper looked at him. "Questions?" A pause. "What's her protocol if the shot window opens and conditions aren't within tolerance?" He said her instead of Reeves or Staff Sergeant, and it landed in the room the way he probably intended it to, as a subtle demotion, a reminder that she was a category before she was a person. Maya answered before Ethan could redirect. "If conditions fall outside the firing solution parameters, I don't take the shot. And if command pressure says otherwise?" "Then I still don't take the shot," she said. "A missed shot at that distance, in that terrain, compromises the team's position. A bad shot is worse than no shot. And you're comfortable making that call under pressure, in real time?" "I've made harder calls," she said. Something in her voice had changed, not louder, not sharper, just denser. Like weight had been added to it from somewhere below. Hooper held her gaze for a second, looking for the crack, the place where she'd break or qualify or retreat. She didn't. He looked back at the mission board. "I have no further questions," he said, which was the least honest sentence he had spoken all morning. Damn. The 72 hours before insertion had a particular texture that everyone on the team knew and nobody talked about. The tempo changed. Sleep became functional rather than restful. Meals happened at the table in the operations center, with people eating and reading mission documents at the same time. Conversation shortened. Humor went away or mutated into something dry and sharp and slightly mean, which was how certain kinds of people handled the specific anxiety of knowing that in a short while, the distance between planning and consequence would disappear entirely. Maya spent most of it in the equipment bay, not just working on the Barrett, though she returned to it repeatedly, running through the mechanical checks with the systematic repetition of someone who found certainty in process. She was also building. Tate found her at 2,200 on the second night, 3 hours after the rest of the team had stood down for rest cycle. She had a small portable workbench set up in the corner of the bay, and she was working on something he couldn't immediately identify. A framework of lightweight aluminum tubing, roughly the dimensions of a large book, with adjustment mechanisms built into 3 access points. "What is that?" he said. She turned it over, showing him the underside. "Portable firing support, custom. The Barrett's bipod is designed for relatively flat surfaces. The firing position on the ridgeline has a 12-degree lateral slope. If I set up on the standard bipod, the rifle's natural point of aim drifts left by the amount the slope deflects it. Right. This corrects for it." She set it down, made a small adjustment to one of the access mechanisms. "I built the first version of this design 4 years ago. This is the 3rd iteration." Tate sat down on an equipment crate across from her. He had coffee. The bad coffee from the Operations Center machine, which had a permanent burnt element taste that everyone complained about and nobody stopped drinking. "You built it 4 years ago," he said, "at the facility." "The one that doesn't exist." She glanced at him. "You've been reading things above your clearance level." Hooper talks. Of course he does. She picked up a small torque wrench and made a final adjustment to the mechanism. "What's Hooper saying?" Tate looked at his coffee, decided the question deserved an honest answer. "That you're a range shooter, that you've never been downrange when the situation turned bad, that the difference between shooting and surviving is something you can't learn in a facility." He paused. He's not saying it to be cruel. He actually believes it. Maya set the torque wrench down. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, Tate had the sense, strong enough to make him slightly uncomfortable, that she was deciding something. Not about what to say, about whether the conversation was worth having. "The facility wasn't just a range," she said finally. "What was it?" "A program, specifically designed to develop marksmanship capability in operationally integrated scenarios." She looked at the firing support frame on the workbench. "We worked with live opposing forces. Full mission simulation, insertion, movement to firing position, engagement, extraction, under time pressure, under physical duress, under—" She stopped. Started again. "They put us in conditions that were designed to make us fail, and then they watched how we responded to failure." "What happened when you failed?" "You reset and did it again." A pause. 47 times over 6 years. Tate did the math on that without intending to. 47 full mission simulations. Some of them were full, some were partial. They'd run you through the first half, and then introduce a variable that made the second half unrecognizable. She picked up the firing support frame and examined it one more time under the work light. The point wasn't the scenarios. The point was learning what happens to your decision-making when the situation stops matching the plan. When you're cold and exhausted and the target window opened 3 seconds earlier than projected and your spotter's calling variables faster than you can input them. She set the frame down. Hooper's not wrong that range shooting is different from combat. He's wrong about whether I know what that difference is. Tate was quiet for a moment. "Have you told Cross any of this?" "He has the classified file." "The file's not the same thing." She looked at him. "No," she agreed, "it's not." Outside the equipment bay, the base was in its deep night register. Minimal personnel, reduced lighting, the specific quiet that a facility had when most of the people in it were in mandated rest cycle even if they weren't sleeping. Somewhere in the distance, a perimeter sensor made its automated check-in with the monitoring station. A door opened and closed. "Why are you still awake?" she asked him. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." "Pre-mission." "Yeah." He looked at his coffee. "Does it go away, the pre-mission thing?" "No," she said. "You just get better at functioning through it." He nodded. That was honest enough to be useful, which was what he'd wanted without knowing he'd wanted it. "Get some sleep, Corporal," she said. "The approach is long and the terrain doesn't care how tired you are." He stood, got to the door. "Reeves." He turned. She was already back to work, making a final notation in the spiral notebook. She didn't look up. "Don't repeat what I said to Hooper," she said. "Not because I'm worried about him, because it won't change anything and it'll just make the insertion more tense than it needs to be." "Okay?" "And Tate?" "Yeah." She did look up then, just briefly. "Thank you for closing the door." He left. She worked until 01:30 when the firing support frame was exactly what she needed it to be, and the notebook had 3 more pages of mission variables, and the Barrett was cleaned and rechecked, and the equipment bay was as quiet as it was going to get. Then she sat back against the wall with the notebook in her lap and closed her eyes and ran through the shot. Not the mechanics. She knew the mechanics. She ran through the moment, the 25 seconds of window, the way the wind would behave at that elevation based on everything she knew about the terrain, the way her body would feel after 14 hours of movement through mountain terrain, the specific fatigue, the cold in her hands, the way her pulse would need to be managed. She ran through it until it felt like something she had already done. That was the only way she knew to prepare for something she hadn't done yet. She was still sitting against the wall, eyes closed, when Ethan Cross walked past the equipment bay door at 0150 on his own sleepless circuit of the facility. He stopped at the doorway, saw her, and, for reasons he didn't examine, didn't disturb her. He stood there for a moment, this man who had read her classified file twice and still felt like he was missing something central, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing against the work-light silence of the equipment bay. Then he walked on. And 3 hours later, when he called the team together for the final pre-insertion brief, the number of people in the room who believed she shouldn't be there had changed. It was still more than 0, but it was smaller than it had been. And the mountain, which did not care about any of their calculations, was waiting. The final pre-insertion brief lasted 40 minutes. Ethan ran it tight. No redundancy, no motivational language, no wasted words. He covered the route and sequence, the contingency decision points Maya had marked in red, the communication protocols, the abort criteria. He covered the extraction window, which was narrow, and the consequences of missing it, which were significant. He covered rules of engagement, which, in a mission with this classification level, were essentially one rule. The shot happens or it doesn't, and everything else is noise. Nobody asked unnecessary questions. That was one of the markers, Ethan had learned over 20 years, of a team that understood the weight of what it was walking into. The teams that asked a lot of questions before an insertion were usually the ones trying to talk themselves into believing the plan was better than it was. A team that went quiet meant they'd already accepted the uncertainty and were saving their energy for the mountain. Maya sat at the far end of the table and said nothing during the brief. She had her notebook open, but she wasn't writing in it. She was listening the way she did everything, completely, without visible effort, in a way that made it hard to tell whether she was absorbing information or simply waiting for the moment when information would stop mattering and action would begin. When Ethan said, "Wheels up at 0300, questions," and nobody spoke, she closed the notebook. That was it. The team dispersed to final gear checks. The operations center began its insertion night rhythm. Reduced personnel, essential comms only, the soft click of keyboards as the intelligence cell ran its last update on the compound's activity patterns. Ethan stayed at the table after the others left. He pulled the topographic overlay toward him and looked at the drainage channel route one more time. Not because he doubted it, because looking at terrain before you entered it was a form of respect, an acknowledgement that no matter how well you'd studied it on paper, it was going to teach you things the paper hadn't. The mountain was always the final authority. He'd learned that in Afghanistan, on a ridgeline outside a village whose name he still remembered even though he'd spent years trying not to, when a plan that had looked perfect on the overlay had met actual terrain and actual weather and actual human error and had come apart in the specific way that well-made plans came apart, not all at once, but in sequence, each piece pulling the next piece with it, until the only thing that mattered was what you did when there was no plan left. He looked at the drainage channel. Then he looked at the firing position. Then he rolled the overlay and went to check his own gear. Set. The helicopter flew low and dark, running without navigation lights, threading through the mountain corridors at an altitude that made the terrain feel very close and very large at the same time. 6 operators, full kit, weapons secured. The crew chief sat near the ramp door with his hand on a strap and his eyes on the darkness outside. Nobody talked during the flight. The rotor noise filled that space adequately. Maya sat with her back against the airframe, the Barrett case between her feet, one hand resting on the top of it, not for security, but out of something closer to habit. Beside her, Tate had his eyes closed, not sleeping, just managing the pre-insertion state through whatever process worked for him. Across from them, Vasquez was running through something in his head, lips moving slightly, a gesture so small it was almost invisible. Checklist, his particular form of preparation. Hooper sat at the far end of the hold with his arms crossed and his eyes open, looking at nothing specific. He'd done his gear check 4 times before boarding. Ethan had watched him do it. The 4th time wasn't about the gear. Ethan sat near the cockpit bulkhead with his radio in his lap, watching the team the way he always did in the final minutes before insertion, not looking for problems, just taking inventory. A thing he'd started doing after Afghanistan, making sure he knew where everyone was while they were still where he could see them. His eyes passed over Maya. She was looking at the ceiling of the helicopter hold, not at anything in particular. Her lips weren't moving. Her hands were still. She had the look of someone who had completed every preparation that could be completed and had made the internal transition to the other state, the one past preparation, where you simply were what you'd made yourself, and the situation would test whether that was enough. He'd seen that look before. On men who had the experience to earn it. He hadn't expected to see it on her. He looked away. They hit the ground at 0347, 2 kilometers north of the drainage channel entry point, in a landing zone that was technically a clearing and practically a slope with ambitions. The helicopter was gone before the rotor wash had settled, sound folding back into the mountain dark as quickly as it had arrived. Cold hit them immediately. Not the sharp cold of the base range, something deeper, more absolute, the cold of altitude that settled into gear and skin and lungs, with the patience of something that had been here long before them and would be here after. Ethan checked the team on night vision. Everyone accounted, everyone moving. They covered the 2 kilometers to the drainage channel in 41 minutes, which was on pace. The approach terrain was rough but navigable. Maya moved near the front of the column, just behind the lead scout. Specialist Chen, youngest on the team, 23, fast and quiet in the way that some people were naturally quick and others spent years trying to manufacture. She wasn't navigating by the map. She had the terrain in her head, and Ethan watched her track their position relative to it with the same peripheral awareness she gave everything. Constant, low effort, complete. The drainage channel was worse than the satellite imagery had suggested. That was also consistent with everything Ethan had learned about terrain. Maps were approximations. Maps showed shapes. They didn't show the texture, the loose shale on the upper sections that moved under your boot before you were ready for it. The narrowing in the channel's second third that forced the team to move single file with packs angled sideways. The section of Class 3 climbing that the elevation data had correctly identified, but that the 2-dimensional representation had failed to convey in terms of what it actually felt like at 0500 with full kit and a Barrett M1 07A1 strapped across your back. Maya climbed it without stopping. Not fast. Nobody moved fast on Class 3 with a 50-pound weapon system, but without stopping. She found handholds by feel in the near dark, shifted her weight in the specific way of someone who understood rock mechanics, moved upward in a sequence that was neither graceful nor hesitant, just competent. The quiet competence of a person doing something hard that they had prepared to do. Hooper was behind her on the climb. He didn't say anything during it, but Ethan, watching from below, saw the moment Hooper's expression changed. The specific moment when Hooper's boot slipped on a shale section and he caught himself on a handhold, and in catching himself looked up and saw her 4 meters above him already past the difficult section and moving steadily toward the ledge, and something in Hooper's face performed an involuntary recalculation. The look of a man who had been wrong about something and was finally in the physical presence of the evidence. They cleared the technical section at 0623, made the alternate rest position at 0741, which was 11 minutes ahead of the projected pace. The channel's terrain had been harder, but Maya's waypoint calculations had built in enough buffer that the delays balanced. Ethan called a 30-minute rest at the position. Non-negotiable. The team needed it, and the firing position was still 4 hours out. They ate in silence. Water, ration blocks, the minimal caloric maintenance of a body being asked to do significant work over a long period. The eastern sky had moved from dark to the gray-blue of early morning, and the mountain around them was beginning to resolve from silhouette to detail. Rock faces, snow patches, the thin line of the drainage channel below them, the larger ridgeline visible to the northeast. Ethan sat beside Maya during the rest stop, not entirely deliberate. The position was naturally sheltered, and she'd chosen it for the same reason he had. After a few minutes of silence, he said, "You're running the timeline in your head." "Wind data," she said. "The thermal pattern at this elevation this time of morning. It'll affect the firing solution differently at 1400 hours than it will at 1100. The window opens at 1347. "I know." She was looking at the northeastern ridgeline. "Based on the morning thermals, I'm expecting a crosswind shift at approximately 1320 that will stabilize by 1340. If the pattern holds, the window should open in close to optimal conditions." A pause. "If the pattern doesn't hold, I'll have to make adjustments in real time." "How long do you need to settle into the firing position before the window?" 40 minutes minimum. 60 is better." "We'll aim for 60. He was quiet for a moment. "The extraction window starts at 14:15, 28 minutes after the target window opens." "Correct." She looked at him. "That's tight." "Yes." She turned back to the ridgeline. "If the shot takes longer than a few seconds into the window—" "Then we move on the shot," Ethan said. "We don't wait for confirmation. You fire, we move. Confirmation comes from the intelligence cell." She nodded once. That was the correct protocol, and they both knew it. But there was something in her nod that said she'd already understood it and was simply closing the loop. They moved at 08:12 up. The final 4 hours broke the team down in different ways. Vasquez pulled a muscle in his left calf on a slope transition at hour 2 and spent the remaining time managing a limp that he refused to acknowledge, redistributing his weight with the practiced discipline of someone determined to keep the injury private until it became impossible to. Tate's pack frame developed a lateral shift from a connector that had cracked under the Class 3 section, and the off-center load was visible in his posture by the 3rd hour, a slight rightward lean that wasn't there at the start. Chen moved fine. Chen always moved fine, which Ethan had begun to suspect was partly youth and partly a body that hadn't yet learned how many things could go wrong. Hooper moved without issue, as Hooper usually did, because Hooper's body was a machine that he maintained with the same humorless professionalism he applied to everything else, and the mountain didn't intimidate him. It was the only environment in which Hooper was purely himself. No performance, no politics, just a man and terrain and the arithmetic of movement. Maya moved the way she had moved for the entire approach, the Barrett across her back, the firing support frame secured to the exterior of her pack, the notebook in her breast pocket, her pace measured, her breathing controlled, her eyes reading the terrain ahead with a continuous low-level scan of someone who didn't distinguish between rest and vigilance. At hour 3, Chen's radio crackled. He stopped, raised his fist. The column halted. Ethan was up to the front in 8 seconds. Chen had the handset close to his ear, his other hand pressed against the earpiece. His face was doing something careful. "Say again," he said quietly. Then, "Copy. Stand by." He looked at Ethan. "Intel cell. Activity change at the compound." "What kind?" "Vehicle movement. 2 technicals. Departed the eastern gate 40 minutes ago. Pattern doesn't match the normal supply rotation." "Direction?" "Northeast." Chen paused. "Commander, that's our extraction corridor." The team had gone still around them. Nobody spoke. Ethan looked at his watch, looked at the topographic overlay he'd pulled from his pocket. The extraction corridor ran northeast from the firing position, the only viable route given the terrain and the helicopter's approach angle. 2 armed vehicles, unscheduled, moving northeast. "Compound perimeter status?" he said. Chen relayed the question, waited. "Unchanged. Target has not departed. Normal personnel rotation inside the wire." "So Nazari's still there?" "Confirmed." Ethan folded the overlay. "Intel cell think the vehicles know we're here?" Negative. Assessment is routine patrol expansion. They've been extending their perimeter range over the past 3 weeks, which meant it might be coincidence, or it might be that Nazari's people had gotten better at covering their ground, which was its own kind of problem. Either way, the extraction corridor now had a variable in it that hadn't been there 6 hours ago. Timeline holds, Ethan said. We press to the firing position. I want eyes on the vehicle positions updated every 20 minutes. He looked at Chen. Get me a second relay frequency in case primary comms degrade at altitude. Copy. They moved. The firing position arrived at 12:48. It was a rocky shelf on the northeastern face of the ridgeline, naturally concealed by an outcropping that created a depression approximately 2 meters deep and 4 meters wide. Below it, the mountain fell away sharply for 400 meters before leveling into the upper plateau. Beyond the plateau, barely visible at this distance even in clear air, the compound sat in the valley like something that had grown there. Low walls, a central building, the small, dark rectangles of outbuildings arranged around a central courtyard. 3,247 meters. The same number she'd been carrying for 17 months. Maya was at the firing position before the rest of the team had fully cleared the approach. She set the Barrett case down without sound, opened it, and began her setup with the focused economy of someone executing a sequence they'd run in their head so many times it had become physical memory. The firing support frame came out first. She positioned it on the shelf's sloped surface and made her adjustments, 12 degrees of lateral correction, the 3 axis points locked in sequence. Then the Barrett, onto the frame, bipod down, the weapon's weight settling into the support with a solidity that she tested with 2 fingers before trusting it. Scope. The magnification set to 25 times for initial range assessment, which she'd adjust once she'd confirmed the target area. Ballistic data card on the stock. Notebook open beside her right hand. She settled into position behind the rifle, adjusted her body to the slope, made 2 small corrections to the support frame that the actual position required versus the calculated position. The difference was minor. Real terrain never matched the projection exactly. But minor was not nothing at 3,247 meters. Ethan set up 2 meters to her right, spotting scope deployed, angled toward the compound. Vasquez and Chen took covered positions 15 meters back, watching the approaches. Hooper and Tate held the channel exit below. The compound was quiet in the scope. Normal personnel movement, 2 guards on the eastern wall. A vehicle, not one of the technicals that had departed, a third one, parked inside the gate. The central building's northern door had been propped open, which it hadn't been in the pre-mission imagery, which meant either a routine ventilation change or a temperature adjustment or something else entirely. Wind? Maya said without looking up from the scope. Ethan checked the mini weather station clipped to his kit. Northwest, 12. Gusting to 16. Humidity? 31%. She made a notation. Thermal layering is running warmer than I projected. The crosswind will shift earlier. She made another notation. I'm adjusting the firing solution. How much? I'll know when the shift happens. She looked up from the scope for the first time since setting up, squinting slightly at the sky to the northwest. The thermal pattern off the western face is running 2 hours ahead of the morning model. Wind's going to stabilize around 1325, not 1340. Ethan processed that. That tightens the window start. It also stabilizes it faster once it settles. She went back to the scope. If Nazari appears on time, we're fine. If he's early, he's never been early in 4 months of pattern analysis. People change their patterns, she said, especially people who've survived 3 attempts. She said it without accusation, just fact. Ethan had no response to it that would have been useful, so he said nothing and watched the compound through his spotting scope. At 1318, his radio produced a single tone in his earpiece. The Intel cell's pattern recognition had flagged something. He pressed the receive button. Target building. Northern door is closing. Personnel consolidation inside the central structure consistent with pre-appearance protocol. The intelligence analyst's voice was controlled, professional. Projection, target appearance in 12 to 18 minutes. Ethan looked at his watch. 13:19. He looked at Maya. She had already made the adjustment to her body position that she made when she moved from observation to preparation. A subtle settling, a lowering of the shoulders, a change in the quality of her breathing. Not visible unless you were watching for it. 12 to 18, he said quietly. I heard it. She made a final notation in the notebook, closed it, moved it out of her immediate field of operation. The wind was at 14 from the northwest. Thermal layer above the plateau was creating a pressure differential that would pull any crosswind slightly downward at the target end of the trajectory, a factor of approximately 2 centimeters of deflection over the full distance, which at this range was not negligible. She adjusted the scope elevation by 1 click. 1 click. A quarter of a minute of angle. At 3,247 meters, that was approximately 3 centimeters of correction. Ethan watched her make the adjustment and said nothing. The next 6 minutes were the kind of time that passed differently than other time. Not slowly. The opposite. With the compressed, too-present quality of extreme attention, where each second had more detail in it than it should, and there was no space between seconds for anything else. At 13:25, the wind shifted. Not the violent shift of a pattern breaking, the clean, progressive shift of a system stabilizing, exactly as Maya had predicted. The northwest vector rotated 3 degrees clockwise. The gusting dropped to a steady 11, and the thermal pressure over the plateau equalized in a way she could measure through the scope by watching a small dust disturbance on the compound's outer wall. She made no adjustments. She had already accounted for this. At 13:31, the compound's northern door opened. A figure emerged. Through Ethan's spotting scope, the detail was insufficient at this range for positive identification: body type, clothing color, movement pattern. He pulled his radio. Intel cell. We have a figure, northern door, compound central. Confirm ID. 11 seconds of silence. Confirmed. Target is visual. Khalid Nazari. Northern courtyard. He has... A brief pause. 2 security personnel. He's moving toward the courtyard center. Ethan lowered the radio. Target confirmed, he said. Maya heard it. Her breathing had already found its rhythm. She was in the space between preparation and execution, the razor-thin state where every variable was as calculated as it was going to get, and the only remaining element was the moment itself. Through the scope, the compound courtyard was 3,247 meters away. Through the scope, Nazari was a shape. A human shape, moving with the unhurried movement of a man in his own space, in what he believed was his own safety, surrounded by the walls and personnel and geography that had kept him alive through 3 previous attempts. He paused in the courtyard center, turned slightly, said something to one of the security personnel. The wind held at 11. Maya's right index finger rested against the trigger guard, not the trigger. She breathed out, found the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, the half-second of physical stillness before the body demanded the next inhale. Wind is steady, Ethan said. She moved her finger to the trigger. Not yet. The pause hadn't reached its center point. She was waiting for the moment inside the moment, the specific half-second when everything in her body was at its most stable, when the crosshairs held without muscular effort because she'd aligned her natural point of aim so precisely that the rifle was pointing at the target without her forcing it. Nazari turned back toward the building. If he walked inside, the window closed. It wouldn't reopen today. The crosshairs were steady. The pause reached its center. She fired. The Barrett's report was enormous in the confined space of the firing shelf. A sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a pressure wave that cleared the outcropping above them and rolled out across the mountain with the authority of something final. 4 seconds and 300 milliseconds. That was the flight time at this distance, at this altitude, at this atmospheric density, accounting for the thermal gradient and the crosswind that had stabilized exactly as she'd calculated. 4 seconds and 300 milliseconds. The longest 4 seconds of Ethan Cross's operational career. Through the spotting scope, he saw the courtyard. He saw the security personnel react, sudden, sharp, the body language of trained men processing a threat. He saw the space where Nazari had been standing. He pressed the radio. Intel cell? Confirmation? The earpiece was silent for 2 seconds. Then, target is down? Confirmed. Target is down. The words entered the firing position, and nobody moved for a moment. Vasquez, 15 meters back, exhaled in a way that sounded like he'd been holding it since the shot. Maya ejected the spent casing. It struck the rock beside the support frame with a sound that was completely ordinary and somehow wrong for the weight of the moment. She cleared the breach, engaged the safety, kept her eye on the scope for 3 more seconds, reading the compound's response. Personnel moving, controlled alarm, the eastern vehicle starting up. The enemy was processing what had happened. They would have the area triangulated within minutes. The shooter's position wouldn't be obvious immediately. At this range, the sound arrived at the compound at a different time than the impact, and the geography scrambled the source direction. But within minutes, experienced personnel would be working it backward. She sat up from the rifle, looked at Ethan. He was still at the spotting scope, his hand on the radio, his face doing something complicated and private. Then he took his eye off the scope and looked at her. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a word yet for what had just happened in the 4-second silence after that shot. The thing that had either confirmed everything or settled something that had been open since the moment he'd pushed her file across the table and said, "This has to be a mistake." What Ethan Cross was feeling, standing on a mountain ledge at 3,247 meters from a dead man, was not triumph. It was closer to correction. The specific sensation of a major error being acknowledged before it could become permanent. "Pack it," he said. His voice was level. The operational voice. "We need to move. Now." Maya was already breaking down the Barrett. The sequence that had taken her 45 seconds at the base took her 32 seconds here because the situation had changed, and the situation was the only thing that dictated pace now. The support frame came off. Components nested. Latches closed. "Vasquez," Ethan called, moving to the approach edge. "Route status." Vasquez was already on the radio. His limp was visible now. He wasn't hiding it anymore because there was no longer any reason to. "Chen's checking the extraction corridor. Tate confirms the technicals moved east. They're not in our path." "How current is that information?" 12 minutes. "Get me an update." The radio crackled. Chen's voice, slightly compressed by the altitude interference. "Extraction corridor is clear. Technicals made a northern turn 7 minutes ago. They're moving away from our route." "Copy." Ethan looked at the team. "We move in 90 seconds. Maya shouldered the Barrett. The frame went back on the pack exterior. She looked once more at the firing shelf, the 2 brass casings on the rock, the small compression marks where the support frame had rested, the precise rectangular gap in the outcropping through which a bullet had traveled 3,247 meters, and found the one thing it was built to find. Then she turned away from it. She didn't look back. That was a thing she'd learned early. You didn't look back at the shot. The shot was done. Looking back at it was for later, in a different place, when the only thing in front of you was the distance home. Right now, between her and home, was a mountain that was about to become very actively hostile. And the 2 vehicles somewhere on its northern face, and the personnel in that compound who were already moving with purpose, and the extraction helicopter that was running its own clock, regardless of theirs. Ethan was at the approach edge. He looked at her as she reached him. She had the Barrett on her back and the notebook in her pocket, and the same expression she'd had in the briefing room when he'd pushed her file away and said, "This has to be a mistake." The expression that gave him nothing. The expression that had turned out to be the most accurate thing in the room. "Move," he said. And they went back into the mountain. Below them, the compound was alive with response. On the far edge of hearing, carried up the slope by altitude and stillness, something that might have been vehicle engines or might have been the wind finding a new channel through the rock. The team moved fast and quiet and did not speak. And the mountain, which did not care who had just done the impossible, received them back into its terrain with the absolute indifference of something that had already forgotten the shot. The descent was nothing like the ascent. Going up, the team had moved with the careful, deliberate patience of people who understood that the mountain would punish hurry. Going down, they moved fast because the alternative was worse, and the mountain punished that too, in different ways. Loose shale that skidded under boots, slope angles that transferred load to knees already taxed by 14 hours of movement. The specific disorientation of descending terrain that looked different from above than it had from below. Vasquez's calf gave him real trouble on the first significant downslope. He didn't say anything about it. He adjusted his weight distribution, shortened his stride, and kept moving, and Tate, who had noticed during the ascent and said nothing then either, positioned himself 2 steps below Vasquez on the steep sections without being asked. Not to catch him, just to be there if the leg buckled wrong. Ethan pushed the pace from the front. Not recklessly. There was a specific speed that was fast enough to matter, and not so fast that it created casualties, and he'd spent years learning where that line was. But the vehicle update from Chen had put the 2 technicals somewhere to the north, and the compound response was active, and active meant moving assets, and moving assets meant the window for clean extraction was closing in real time. His radio traffic was clipped and frequent. Intel cell updates every 8 minutes, Chen running comms while moving, the handset at his ear, translating compressed information into route decisions that he passed to Ethan with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned that in bad situations, words cost time. Maya was at the rear of the column. The Barrett was still on her back. She'd offered once, at the first waypoint below the firing position, to redistribute the weight. The Barrett plus the frame, and her personal kit was well over 60 pounds. And Ethan had said no, and she hadn't offered again. Not pride. Practicality. Redistributing the weapon meant someone else managing a piece of equipment they hadn't carried for 14 hours in a descent configuration with enemy vehicles in the area. The math didn't work. So she carried it, and she moved, and the mountain gave them what it gave them. A section of drainage channel that had partially collapsed since the ascent, which cost them 9 minutes rerouting around the unstable section. A wind change that dropped visibility in the upper corridor to approximately 40 meters for 6 minutes before clearing. A radio dead zone between waypoints 3 and 4, where Chen's relay failed twice, and Ethan had to make 2 route decisions on terrain read alone. Neither decision was wrong. That was the thing about Ethan Cross that his personnel file didn't capture adequately. He was good under pressure in the specific way that mattered, which was not that he didn't feel the pressure, but that he processed it faster than it could distort him. The decisions came clean. Not perfect, but clean. They cleared the lower drainage channel at 15:49, 43 minutes behind the projected timeline, which was within the extraction window's buffer by 11 minutes. 11 minutes was not comfortable, but it was 11 minutes. The landing zone was a flat shelf, roughly cleared, marked by Chen who'd reached it 3 minutes ahead of the main element. The helicopter was inbound. Ethan could hear it before he could see it, the specific rhythm of rotor blades at distance, carried by the mountain air. He did a visual count of the team. Chen, Vasquez, moving, upright, jaw set in the expression of a man managing pain through will alone. Tate, pack shifted, moving slightly sideways to compensate. Hooper, tight and controlled, scanning the ridgeline above them with habitual vigilance. Maya, Barrett, on her back, standing at the edge of the LZ perimeter and looking not at the approaching helicopter but at the northeastern ridgeline where the last known position of the technicals had been. The helicopter came in fast and low, the way extraction birds moved when the LZ wasn't secure. Rotor wash hit them hard, dust, grit, the cold blast of displaced air. They loaded in sequence. 40 seconds from touchdown to lift, the mountain fell away beneath them. Nobody said anything for the first several minutes of flight. The crew chief looked at Vasquez's leg and Vasquez shook his head, which the crew chief accepted with the resigned expression of someone accustomed to operators refusing medical acknowledgement in the field. Tate looked at the floor of the hold. Hooper looked at the darkness beyond the ramp. Chen had his eyes closed. Actually closed. Not the pre-mission management posture, but genuine depletion, the closed eyes of someone whose body had called in a debt. Ethan looked at Maya. She was sitting with the Barrett case between her feet again. Same position as the flight in, her right hand resting on the top of it. The spiral notebook was out. She had it open in her lap, and she was writing something, small and precise, in the flight's vibration, which should have made the writing illegible, but didn't. He watched her write for a moment. "Wind data?" he said. She looked up. "Shot record, while it's current." He nodded. She went back to writing. Outside, the mountain range moved beneath them, dark ridgelines against a sky that had gone the deep slate gray of late afternoon in high altitude. The compound was back there somewhere, unreachable now, and in it or near it, something that had needed ending had ended. Ethan looked out the ramp door. He was already thinking about the debrief. Fort Langley received them at 1847. The medical cell took Vasquez immediately. The calf injury was a partial tear, which he had been moving on for approximately 7 hours, which the attending medic communicated with the specific controlled expression of someone who had opinions they were professionally suppressing. Vasquez went with the medics without argument, which was its own indicator of how bad the leg actually was, since Vasquez arguing with medics was his baseline state. Tate went to the equipment bay to secure the team's kit. Chen went to communications to run the post-mission radio log. Hooper went, Ethan noticed, directly to the debriefing room and sat down, which was not standard procedure and was therefore a statement of some kind. Maya went to the equipment bay, not to drop the Barrett, to break it down properly, clean it, log its condition. The same sequence she'd run every night at the facility for 6 years. Ethan let her have 20 minutes. Then he went to the equipment bay. She had the Barrett on the work table, partially disassembled. The firing support frame was beside it, aluminum surfaces showing the scuff marks of actual mountain terrain rather than the clean edges of equipment that had only ever seen controlled use. She was running a bore brush through the barrel with the systematic attention she gave every mechanical task. "Debrief in 10, Ethan said. "I'll be there." He didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work, and he said, "How's your hands?" She looked at her hands. The cold at altitude had done what it did. The knuckles were cracked at 3 points, right hand worse than left, which was the grip hand. There was a cut along the index finger from the Class 3 section that she hadn't mentioned and hadn't treated. "Fine," she said. "That needs antiseptic." After the debrief, he looked at her for a moment. "You can say you're tired." "I know. You don't have to perform." She set down the bore brush and looked at him directly, not with hostility, with the same even assessment she'd applied to him since the first briefing, the look that made him feel like he was being read accurately in a way he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I'm not performing," she said. "This is just how I do it." He nodded once. Left. She was in the debriefing room in 9 minutes. The debriefing room had the particular atmosphere of a space that had absorbed a lot of difficult conversations and retained none of them. Institutional walls, a long table, overhead lighting that was adequate and nothing else. Vale was at the head of the table, having materialized from wherever Pentagon liaisons went during operational periods. His suit was different from this morning, which meant he'd had time to change, which meant he'd been briefed before the team landed, which meant the intelligence cell had moved faster than Ethan expected. Or Vale had sources inside the intel cell. Also possible. Probably both. Hooper was already seated, as noted. Tate came in 30 seconds after Maya. Chen was last, still holding a comms printout. Ethan sat at the center of the table. Maya sat across from him. Vale opened it. "Mission outcome is confirmed. Target eliminated at 1336 local. Intelligence cell has visual confirmation from the compound's satellite coverage." The shot was, he paused, and in the pause made the small adjustment of a man who'd been going to use one word and had chosen a different one. "Effective." "The route change," Hooper said. He wasn't waiting for an invitation. "I want that on the record. The alternate drainage channel approach added 4 hours and created an extraction timeline that gave us 11 minutes of buffer." 11 minutes was sufficient, Ethan said. 11 minutes is not a margin. 11 minutes is a near miss dressed up as a plan working. "Dennis, I'm not challenging the outcome," Hooper said. "I'm saying the route change was a significant variable, and I want the reasoning on record for the after action." Ethan looked at him. "The reasoning is on record. The original approach had both previous teams arriving at the firing position compromised. The alternate route eliminated that risk at the cost of timeline. That was a deliberate trade. Made by someone who had never been on a live mission." The room went quiet in a way that had edges. Maya looked at Hooper. Not with heat, with attention. The look of someone deciding whether a statement warranted a response and concluding that it did. "The route was geometrically sound," she said. Her voice was the same even register. "The timeline buffer was calculated with variance built in. We used 43 of those variance minutes. The remaining 11 were sufficient. She paused. If you want to argue the route was wrong, you need an alternative that addresses the observation post-exposure problem. I've looked. There isn't one. That's your assessment. It's also the assessment of the previous 2 mission planners who attempted the original route and came back empty. Hooper's jaw worked. You weren't there for the original attempts. No, I reviewed the after-action reports. Both teams reported the firing position arrival as compromised, elevated physiological state, insufficient settling time, shot conditions degraded before the window even opened. She looked at him steadily. The route wasn't why those shots missed. The route is why the shooter arrived without capacity to take them. The room was quiet again. Vale, at the head of the table, was making notes that he seemed very interested in making. Tate was looking at the table surface. Chen was looking at the ceiling, which was the posture of someone who wanted to be somewhere else, and was managing that want quietly. Hooper sat back in his chair. He was working something through. Ethan could see it, the internal processing of a man who was too experienced to simply dismiss what he'd just heard, and too invested in his prior position to accept it cleanly. The after-action on the technical vehicles, Ethan said, redirecting. Chen looked at his printout. 2 vehicles. Northeastern Perimeter Patrol departed the compound at approximately 0856. Intel cell assessment is routine patrol expansion consistent with the pattern increase over the past 3 weeks. They turned north at 1142 and were approximately 11 kilometers from the extraction corridor when we lifted. He paused. Assessment is they were not responding to our presence. The timing was coincidental. Or, Hooper said, Nazari's people had gotten better, and we got lucky. Both things can be true, Maya said. Hooper looked at her. The patrol expansion is real, she said. They've been extending their coverage. Eventually, that pattern would have closed the window we use today. The mission timing wasn't arbitrary, but it was calibrated to the closing window. She paused. That's in the original submission, 17 months ago. Another quiet. Vale set down his pen. Staff Sergeant Reeves, the submission you're referring to is classified above most of this room's clearance level, Ethan said. I'll cover the relevant elements in the command level after action. For this debrief, the operational outcome and the route assessment are sufficient. Vale nodded slowly. Hooper said, What submission? Ethan looked at him. Above your clearance level, Dennis. I'm the team sergeant. And the clearance level is what it is. Ethan's voice was level, not dismissive, factual. The after-action will note your route objection and the operational outcome. Both go in the record. He looked around the table. The mission result speaks for itself. We're done here. Chairs moved, people stood. Hooper got to the door and turned. Not to the room, said, to Maya specifically. She was still at the table, the notebook open, making a final notation. He stood there for a moment. The kind of moment where a man was in the specific position of having been wrong about something and being in the physical presence of the evidence of that wrongness, and was deciding what to do with that position. The Class 3 section, he said. On the ascent, you didn't stop. She looked up from the notebook. 60-pound kit, he said. Class 3. You didn't stop. Neither did you, she said. A pause. I've done Class 3 on that weight before, he said. So have I. Something crossed Hooper's face, not quite a concession, more like a door opening slightly, the light through the gap still narrow but present. He left without saying anything else. Maya went back to the notebook. Tate was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway the same way Hooper had, which made her look up again. For what it's worth, he said, I knew from the equipment bay. Knew what? That you'd done it before, the live mission stuff. I knew from the way you talked about it. He paused. 47 simulations. Nobody talks about failure that specifically unless they know exactly what failure costs. She looked at him. He shrugged. Just for what it's worth. He left. Touchan. Ethan found Vale in the corridor outside. Vale was waiting for him. He had the posture of a man who had been waiting and had known he would be waiting and was fine with it. Walk with me, Ethan said. They walked. The corridor was empty at this hour. The base had the late evening quality of a facility winding down after a significant operational period. Not quiet exactly, but the activity had moved from urgent to administrative, the specific decompression of people who had been holding tension and were now setting it down carefully. The submission, Ethan said. 17 months ago. Who received it? The program office. And who decided not to act on it? Vale was quiet for a moment. There was a committee assessment. Who was on the committee? Ethan. Who was on the committee? Vale looked at the corridor wall. 3 senior planners. 2 of them had prior involvement with the original attempt packages. They reviewed the submission and concluded the approach was... He stopped. What? Theoretically sound, but operationally unverified, given the submitter's lack of combat record. Ethan stopped walking. Vale stopped beside him. She submitted the exact approach that worked today, Ethan said, 17 months ago, and 3 people with prior investment in a failed approach decided the person who identified the correct approach couldn't be trusted to execute it. That's one way to characterize it. Is there another way? Vale looked at him directly. The standard process for unverified submitters is a field qualification before operational integration. The committee requested that she complete a standard combat deployment prior to being considered for... She'd been running simulations for 6 years in a classified program that their clearance didn't cover. Ethan's voice had gone very flat. They didn't know what she'd done. They saw a file with no combat deployments, and they made a decision. Yes. The same way I did. Vale didn't respond to that. He was giving Ethan the space to carry it, which was the right call. Ethan started walking again, slower. The program she came from, he said. The classified facility. Her father, what was his role? Vale was quiet for a beat. Her father was the program's founding director. He designed the simulation architecture, the physiological training models, the ballistic integration protocols. A pause. He died 4 years ago. She stayed in the program for 2 more years after his death. Ethan processed that. She stayed to finish what he built, he said. She stayed, Vale said, to prove that what he built worked. A pause. She submitted the Nazari mission package 8 months after his death. The committee reviewed it 14 months after that. He paused again. She waited 17 months for them to act on a solution she'd already built and tested, and during those 17 months, the patrol expansion continued and the window kept closing. Ethan stopped at the end of the corridor. He looked at the exterior door. Through the small reinforced window in the door, the base was visible. The vehicle pool, the far fence line, the strip of sky above the eastern mountains going from slate to dark. She didn't tell me any of this, he said. She never does, Vale said. The program office has 3 files on her. The short one she lets people see, the classified one you read, and a third one, personal correspondence, mission proposal drafts, the 17-month timeline of the committee review, that exists because someone on the administrative staff was keeping records that weren't officially required. He paused. I've read all 3. She never asked anyone to advocate for her. She just kept submitting the work. Ethan stood at the door for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the equipment bay. She was still there. The Barrett was fully reassembled now, clean, in its case, latches secured. The firing support frame was beside it, similarly documented in the condition log she'd filled out in the notebook. She was sitting on the equipment crate, still in her mission gear, the cut on her index finger that she'd said she'd treat after the debrief still untreated. She had the notebook in her lap, but she wasn't writing. She was looking at the wall across from her with the look of a person who had finished doing all the things that needed doing and was now in the moment after, which was always harder than the doing. Ethan came in and sat down on the crate across from her. She looked at him. He didn't know exactly where to start, so he started with the true thing. I read the 3rd file, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Vale. Yes. She looked at the wall again. Something in her expression had shifted. Not much, a slight tightening around the eyes. The look of a person making an internal adjustment. The committee, Ethan said. 17 months. 14, she said. The submission took 3 months to clear the classification filter before it reached them. 14 months. Yes. And during that time, I waited. She said it without bitterness, just fact. That's what you do when the process is slower than the problem. You wait and you keep the work current and you be ready for when they catch up. A pause. Or you don't be ready, and when the window finally opens, you miss it. You didn't miss it. No. Ethan looked at his hands for a moment, at the table, at the Barrett case. Your father built the program, he said. She was quiet for a longer moment this time. He built it because he believed the selection model was wrong, she said. The standard model filtered for demonstrated combat record, which meant you only found the capability after it had already been proven in conditions you couldn't control. He thought you should be able to build the capability first. Test it in controlled conditions rigorous enough to predict performance in real ones. She paused. He was right. The program worked. The problem was that nobody who mattered would look at the output without the combat record, because the combat record was the only thing they understood. So you needed this mission, Ethan said. She looked at him. I needed this mission, she said. Yes. It was the most direct thing she'd said in 4 days, and it cost her something. The directness. He could see it in the slight tension around her mouth, the way she looked back at the wall immediately after, as if she'd exposed something and needed to cover it again. Your father, Ethan said. Did he know about the Nazari submission? He died before I submitted it. She was quiet for a moment. But the mission profile, the approach geometry, the firing solution parameters, the site selection, that was built using the analytical framework he developed. So in some ways, yes. She paused. He would have known. The equipment bay was quiet. Somewhere outside, a vehicle ran across the compound. A radio crackled in a distant room and went quiet. The generators maintained their constant low register. I was wrong, Ethan said. From the beginning, before I knew anything about you, I made a decision based on... He stopped, tried again. Based on what you looked like, what your file looked like, what I expected. She looked at him. I know, she said. You deserve better. Probably. She said it without edge, without the specific flatness that would have meant she was suppressing the edge, just honestly, as a reasonable assessment. But it doesn't matter now. It matters. It matters for the next person, she said. The next person who comes through with a short file and no combat record and a committee that doesn't know what to do with them. It matters for that. She looked at the Barrett case. For me, I'm done with this part. I don't carry yesterday when today is still happening. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, What do you want? After the after action is filed? After the program office does whatever they do with the outcome? What do you actually want to happen next? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, The program shouldn't have needed one successful mission to prove it worked. It should have been evaluated on its own terms. The simulation data was sufficient. She paused. I want the evaluation process to change. Not for me. The process for the next person who goes through the program. They shouldn't need a Nazari to be believed. That's a systemic change, he said. Committees, Pentagon review cycles, that takes... I know what it takes, she said. I've been navigating it for 6 years. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm answering your question. He nodded. She looked at the cut on her finger, finally picked up the small med kit from the shelf beside her and opened it, which she would have done an hour ago if she hadn't been waiting for the conversation that she'd apparently known was coming. She treated the cut with the same methodical attention she gave everything. Ethan stood to go. Cross. He turned. She was winding the bandage without looking at him. Her hands were steady. The drainage channel, she said. I need that route formally documented in the operational archive, with the analytical reasoning, not just the outcome. A pause. For the next mission planning team that looks at this terrain, I'll make sure it's in the record, he said. She nodded once. He left. She sat in the equipment bay for a while longer, in the way she did after missions that had cost what this one had cost. Not in casualties, but in the specific expenditure of a person who had carried something for a long time and had finally set it down in the only place it was ever going to be set down, which was the proof that it had been worth carrying. The Barrett sat in its case beside her. Outside, the mountain range was dark and still and impossibly indifferent to everything that had happened in its terrain today. The compound was there, somewhere in the distance, and in it or near it, confirmation cables were running to intelligence cells in buildings on the other side of the world. And somewhere in those buildings, people who had never seen the drainage channel or the firing shelf or the way the crosswind stabilized at 1,325 exactly as calculated were reading the outcome and understanding only the final number. 3,247 meters. That was all they would ever know. And she was the only person in the world who knew what the number actually meant. Not the distance, but everything it had taken to cross it. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the med kit, picked up the notebook, and began writing the full shot record from memory, because the data mattered even when the audience for it was only herself. Especially then. The shot record took her 40 minutes to complete. Not because the data was complicated. She had it all, every variable cataloged in the moment it occurred, stored with the precision of a mind trained to retain exactly this kind of information under exactly this kind of physical and psychological load. It took 40 minutes because she wrote it correctly. Full atmospheric readings at the time of shot. Thermal gradient assessment, pre- and post-wind shift, scope adjustments made and their reasoning. The support frame correction angle and its effect on natural point of aim. The specific quality of the 4-second flight time, what she'd felt in the trigger, in her breathing, in the half-second of held stillness before the shot broke. She wrote it like it mattered because it did matter, even though the only person who would read this version was her. The official shot record was in Chen's comms log and Vale's mission archive, and eventually some committee's review file. This one was the true record, the one that captured not just the outcome, but the process that produced it, in enough detail that some future shooter coming up through a program that might or might not still exist, could read it and understand not just what had happened, but how. Her father had kept records like this. She'd found them after he died, filling 3 notebooks in his handwriting, dense with technical data and marginal notes and occasional observations that crossed from data into something else entirely. The kind of honest accounting that a person did when they were writing for themselves rather than for a committee. She had all 3 notebooks. She'd read them more times than she could count. She closed her own notebook and sat in the equipment bay for a moment, in the particular quiet that followed the completion of something. Then she stood, picked up the Barrett case, and carried it to the long-term storage rack at the far wall. She logged it in, set it on the rack with the care she gave it every time. Not ceremony, just respect for a piece of equipment that had done exactly what it was built to do. She turned off the work light, walked out. Well, the base looked different at night after a mission, or she looked at it differently. She'd never been entirely sure which. The same buildings, the same fences, the same strip of mountain sky above the eastern ridgeline. But the air had a different weight to it. The specific gravity of a place where something significant had recently occurred and was now being absorbed, processed, filed. She walked to the barracks building and stopped at the small common room at the end of the corridor, where someone, she suspected Tate, had left a pot of coffee that was approximately an hour old and therefore significantly better than the operations center machine. She poured a cup, sat at the small table. Outside the window, the base perimeter lights made a slow orange line against the dark. She was still sitting there when Hooper came in at 21:40. He stopped when he saw her. A brief hesitation. Not the dramatic kind, just the half-second recalibration of a man who'd been expecting an empty room and found it wasn't. He looked at the coffee pot. "How old is that?" he said. "Hour, maybe." He poured a cup anyway, stood at the counter with it, not moving to the table, not leaving, occupying the room the way people occupied rooms when they had something to say and hadn't yet decided exactly how to say it. She drank her coffee and waited. "The calf section," he said. "On the descent. You stayed behind Vasquez." "Yes." "That wasn't your assigned position." "No." He turned the cup in his hands. "He would have managed. I know." "He didn't need—" "I know," she said again. "I wasn't there because he needed it. I was there because the position made sense given the terrain and his movement pattern. If the leg had gone bad on a steep section, I was carrying the weight that could absorb the momentum." She looked at her cup. "It was logistics, not charity." Hooper was quiet for a moment. He's going to be off rotation for 6 weeks. The partial tear. Yes. He drank his coffee, set the cup down, picked it back up. You knew it was a partial tear during the descent. I assessed it as likely. I didn't have imaging. But you knew. I thought so. Hooper set the cup down again, this time with the finality of a man who was done with it as a prop. He turned to face her. I've been running teams for 11 years, he said. I've been wrong about people before, not often, but before. He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone putting down something heavy that they'd been carrying in a way that didn't look like carrying. I was wrong about you. She looked at him. And I want to say, I want it to be on record, even if the record is just this room, that the things I said in the briefing, the first day. He stopped, started again. The things I didn't say, which I let other people say without correcting. That was wrong. It was unprofessional, and it was wrong, and it made an already difficult entry into an operation harder than it needed to be. The common room was quiet enough that the perimeter generator hum was audible. She looked at him for a moment. Hooper was not a man who did this easily. The admission cost him. She could see that, which meant it was genuine rather than procedural. You believed what you said, she told him, about combat experience and range experience being different. I did. You weren't entirely wrong about the principle. He blinked. That was not what he'd expected. The gap between range performance and live conditions is real, she said. You've seen people close out in real terrain who are excellent in controlled settings. That's a real phenomenon. Your read on me was wrong, but the underlying concern wasn't unreasonable. She paused. I just had more context for it than my files showed. Hooper looked at her for a long moment. The expression of a man who had come in prepared to take a punch and had instead been handed something considerably harder to deal with, an honest, fair assessment. The drainage channel, he said. I'm going to put a note in the after-action that the route was sound. Specifically, that my objection was based on incomplete information about the submitter. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. His jaw set slightly. I'm going to. She nodded. He picked up his cup, looked at the small amount of coffee remaining in it, and drank it, set the cup in the small sink, turned to go. Hooper? He turned. Vasquez's weight on the descent, she said. You noticed before I repositioned. He looked at her. You were already running the calculation, she said. I saw it. You'd identified the steep section risk and you were working out the covered geometry. She paused. You would have moved if I hadn't. Something shifted in his face. Faint, but there. The specific look of a man being seen accurately by someone he'd underestimated, which was a different experience than being seen accurately by someone you'd already respected. Maybe, he said. Not maybe. He left. She sat with her coffee for another few minutes. It had gone cold enough to be unpleasant, but she drank the last of it anyway, because it was there, and she had learned not to waste things that had been offered. The formal after-action review convened at 0900 the following morning. Vale ran it. Senior personnel only. Ethan, Hooper, the intelligence cell lead, a representative from the program office whose name Maya didn't know and whose role seemed to be documentation and managed silence. Maya attended because Ethan had put her on the attendance list, which was itself a statement, because after-action reviews at this classification level did not typically include staff sergeants. The program office representative noticed this. His name was Garrett, Maya learned from the nameplate on the folder he'd brought. Mid-50s, the posture of a man who had spent many years in rooms like this one and had learned that the safest position was thorough documentation and minimal personal exposure. He noticed her in the room the way people notice things they hadn't planned for, with a brief stillness, a recalibration, and then the resumption of their prepared posture. She noticed him notice. Vale opened the review and ran through the mission outcome efficiently. Timeline, route, engagement, extraction, confirmed result. Clean and factual and designed to close loops rather than open them. Then Garrett said, the route modification. Vale looked at him. The alternate drainage channel approach. Yes, it's documented in detail. The modification was proposed by Staff Sergeant Reeves, Garrett said, based on an analytical submission from 17 months ago. Correct. The submission that was reviewed by the planning committee and deferred pending combat qualification. Also correct, Vale said. Garrett made a note. The committee's assessment was made in good faith given the information available to them at the time. The room was quiet. Ethan looked at Garrett with the expression of a man measuring the distance between what he wanted to say and what was strategically useful. The committee's assessment, Ethan said, was made without access to the submitter's classified program file, which contained 6 years of operational simulation data, 47 full mission exercises, and a performance record that most active operators couldn't match in controlled conditions. He paused. That's not good faith with incomplete information. That's a clearance gap that produced a 17-month delay on a mission that had a closing window. Garrett looked at him. The clearance structure exists to protect classified programs, Ethan said. It should not exist to prevent accurate evaluation of the people those programs produce. He looked at Garrett directly. The committee rejected a correct solution because they didn't have access to the data that would have told them it was correct. That's a process failure, and I want it on record as a process failure, not as a judgment call. Garrett made a longer note this time. Maya watched him make it. She had known, going in, that this meeting would happen. She had known there would be a Garrett in it. Some version of Garrett, the institutional representative whose function was to absorb and document and redirect rather than to acknowledge. She had spent 17 months dealing with the committee that Garrett was here to represent. She knew how these rooms worked. What she hadn't planned for was Ethan Cross making the argument she'd stopped expecting anyone to make. Staff Sergeant Reeves, Garrett said, looking at her for the first time in the meeting. The program your father founded. You've been I want to characterize this correctly, its primary active participant for the past 6 years. Participant and instructor, she said. The program had 4 other active participants over that period. 2 have since been integrated into operational units through standard qualification channels. And the other 2? 1 left the military. 1 is still in the program. Garrett nodded, made another note. The program office has been considering the program's future, given the... He paused, chose a word. Outcome of this mission, there's likely to be renewed interest in its evaluation. Renewed interest, she said. Yes. The program has submitted evaluation requests to the program office 4 times in 6 years, she said, including the mission submission 17 months ago, which was functionally an evaluation request. Here is the program's analytical output. Please assess it on its merits. She looked at him steadily. The renewed interest is welcome. I'd suggest the evaluation focus on the simulation data rather than the combat record of individual participants, since the point of the program is to build capacity before exposure rather than after. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That's noted, he said. I'd like it to be more than noted, she said. Another quiet. Vale, at the head of the table, looked at his hands. Ethan looked at Maya with the expression of someone watching a thing they'd underestimated reveal one more layer and understanding that there were probably more layers still. Garrett set down his pen, looked at her. The look of a man who had come into a room expecting to manage an outcome and was now being asked to reconsider the shape of the outcome itself. What are you actually asking for, he said. A formal evaluation process, she said. Documented criteria. Applied to the simulation data that already exists, using metrics that don't require combat exposure as a prerequisite, and a clear pathway for participants who complete the program to receive operational integration assessment without having to wait for a mission like this one to prove the program works. She paused. The program works. It worked before this mission. The evidence was in the submission. The evaluation process failed, not the program. Garrett picked his pen back up. He wrote for a longer time than any of his previous notes had required. When he finished, he looked up. I'll take this back to the program office. With a recommendation? Ethan said. Garrett looked at Ethan, then at Maya, then back at his notes. With the recommendation, he said, that the evaluation criteria be reviewed. It was not a victory. It was the beginning of a process that would take months and involve committees and review cycles and people who hadn't been in this room and who would have their own versions of the objections that Hooper had raised and that Garrett was now carefully documenting. Maya knew that. She had always known that. She nodded once and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say in this room today. The rest was work, and the work would take the time it took, and she had learned, over 17 months of waiting, over 6 years of building something that no committee had yet acknowledged, that the work was the only thing she could actually control. Tom. She found Ethan outside after the review. He was standing at the edge of the vehicle pool, looking at the eastern mountains the way he'd been looking at them on and off since she'd arrived at this base. She was beginning to think the mountains were where he put things he didn't know what else to do with. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. Garrett will go back and write a measured report, Ethan said. It'll recommend a review. The review will take 6 months minimum. There'll be another committee. I know. And you're okay with that? I'm not okay with it, she said. I think it's too slow and the criteria are still going to be wrong, and the people on the next committee are probably going to be a version of the people on the last committee. She paused. But it's moving. It wasn't moving before. Ethan looked at the mountains. I'm going to submit a separate command assessment, he said, specifically addressing the clearance gap. The fact that the committee evaluated your submission without access to your program file. That's not a systemic critique. It's a specific documentable failure with a specific documentable fix. He paused. Garrett can't absorb that into a vague recommendation. It's too concrete. She looked at him. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. It's going to create friction with the program office. Probably. Garrett will note it, Ethan said, and it'll go into the record, and when the review happens, it'll be in the file. He turned to look at her. Your father spent years building something that the institution wasn't ready to look at. I'm not going to let the documentation of this mission bury that in a recommendation to review criteria. That's not enough. Maya looked at him. She had prepared coming to this base for many versions of how this would go. She'd prepared for hostility and dismissal, which she'd received. She'd prepared for grudging acceptance after the range, which had happened. She'd prepared for the after-action room and Garrett and the measured institutional response. She hadn't prepared for this. Not because she'd thought it was impossible, because she'd learned, over 6 years, to calibrate her expectations to the evidence. And the evidence had never included a commander who'd spent the first day of an operation telling her she didn't belong choosing, after the mission, to go back into the institutional machinery on her behalf. Why? She said. The question came out simpler than she'd intended. Ethan looked at the mountains again. His jaw was tight in the way it went when he was working something through that he didn't have fully processed language for yet. Because I made the same mistake the committee made, he said. And I saw it clearly enough that I don't get to just apologize for it and move on. That's too easy. He paused. I looked at a short file and a woman in coveralls and decided I knew what I was looking at. And I was wrong in a way that was my fault, not a reasonable limitation of available information. He turned back to her. The committee had a clearance gap. I didn't. I had the same file they had plus everything I could see in front of me, and I still made the same call. He was quiet for a moment. That means the problem isn't just the process. It's the assumption underneath the process. And I can document the process failure. The other thing I have to carry myself. She looked at him for a long moment. The mountains behind him were catching the morning light on their eastern faces now, the snow on the upper ridges going from white to the specific pale gold of early direct sun. It was, objectively, a very clear morning, the kind that followed difficult nights. Your father, Ethan said. The notebooks you kept referencing when you talked about the program. Did he write down what he thought the program would eventually produce? She was quiet for a moment. He wrote a lot of things. Did he see this? The mission? The outcome? Did he believed the program would work, she said. He didn't need a specific outcome to believe that. He believed in the methodology. She paused. He used to say that you couldn't build proof before you built the thing. You had to build the thing first, in good faith, and trust that the proof would follow. She paused again. He was more patient than I am. Ethan almost smiled. Not quite. That's hard to imagine. I'm not as patient as I look, she said. This time he did smile. A small one, the kind that costs something. She looked at the mountains. He also wrote, she said, that the point of the program wasn't the shot. It was everything before the shot: the preparation, the analysis, the building of the capacity. The shot was just the evidence that the preparation worked. If you only cared about the shot, you could find a way to get there with luck and talent and favorable conditions. She paused. He wanted to build something that worked independent of those things, that worked when the conditions were wrong and the luck was against you and the talent alone wasn't enough. He built it, Ethan said. We built it, she said. He designed it. I ran it for 6 years after he died. That's both of us. A silence. The vehicle pool was starting to move. Morning activity, drivers running their checks, the first outgoing vehicle of the day pulling toward the gate. Normal sounds. The sounds of a base returning to its baseline after a period of elevated operational tempo. What do you do now? Ethan said. She had been thinking about this since the equipment bay the previous night. Since she'd closed the shot record notebook and carried the Barrett to the storage rack and turned off the work light. She'd been thinking about it in the specific way she thought about things that had been decided before she was ready to articulate them, knowing the answer and working backward to the understanding of why it was the answer. I go back, she said, to the facility, to the program. She looked at him. There's one participant still in it. She's been in it for 2 years. She's better than I was at her point in the timeline, and I was not bad. She paused. And the evaluation process is going to change. Slowly, badly, with committees and friction, but it's going to change. And when it does, I need someone in the program who's ready for what the changed process will actually require. Not just the simulation data, the operational integration component. She paused. I need to build what comes after the proof. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long? He said. As long as it takes. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. She looked at him. My father ran the program for 8 years before he died. He knew at the beginning that he wouldn't see the outcome he was working toward. He built it anyway. She paused. I'm 33. I've got time. Ethan looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a very long series of corrections and was standing in the final one, which was not a triumphant place to stand, just a true one. If the program office drags their feet on the evaluation review, he said, I'm going to need someone I can call who knows where the documentation is and what it says. I'll make sure you have a number. A real one, not the program office relay. A real one, she said. He nodded. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, and she saw the thing that crossed his face. Not reluctance, but recognition. The weight of what the handshake meant given how the first day had gone. He took her hand and shook it, and it was a firm, brief, unceremonious handshake that carried more than any of the apologies or admissions the past 24 hours had produced, because handshakes between people like them were operational agreements, not gestures. She left. He watched her go. Sut. She departed Fort Langley at 1400 in a vehicle to the airfield, in the same olive coveralls she'd arrived in, with the same small bag and the same spiral notebook in her breast pocket, and nothing else that hadn't come in with her. Tate was at the vehicle pool when she left. He was doing something with a pack frame that didn't need doing, which meant he was there to be there, which she understood and didn't comment on. The new connector's on order, he said, gesturing at the frame. Good, she said. He put the frame down. The other participant in the program. Is she good? Maya looked at him. Why? He shrugged. It was the shrug of someone who had spent 4 days watching something that had reconfigured something in how they understood things, and was now trying to figure out what to do with the reconfigured version. Because if the evaluation process changes, he said, and there's an integration assessment, I'd want to know what I was looking at. You want to be on the assessment team? If there is one. She considered him for a moment. Danny Tate, 26 years old, who had closed the equipment bay door when she'd asked, and sat with her in the early hours and understood, without being told, what 47 simulation cycles meant about a person's relationship with failure. You'd have to apply through the program office, she said, once the evaluation framework is formalized. I know. It'll take time. I figured. She opened the vehicle door, paused. Tate. He looked at her. She's better than good, Maya said. He nodded once. The small, serious nod of someone filing information they intended to act on. She got in the vehicle. The base moved past the window as the vehicle pulled out. The operations center, the equipment bays, the long fence line, the eastern ridge line behind it with its snow-covered upper face catching the afternoon sun. She watched it without the particular feeling of leaving a place she'd wanted to stay. She had done what she'd come to do. The leaving was part of the same operation. The mountains receded behind the vehicle. She opened the notebook, turned to a fresh page near the back, wrote a date, a location, a single line that would mean something to the person who read it next, the participant who had been in the program for 2 years, who didn't know yet that the world had just shifted slightly in her direction, who was still running her simulations in a facility that didn't exist, building something the committees hadn't acknowledged yet. Maya wrote, "The window opened. We were ready. Be ready." She capped the pen, looked out the window at the mountains one last time. They were exactly what they'd always been, large and cold and indifferent, and precisely as difficult as the terrain data had predicted, no more and no less. They didn't know what had happened on their ridgelines 2 days ago. They didn't know what it had cost or what it had proved or what it had started. She didn't need them to. She knew. And somewhere in a facility that didn't officially exist, a woman who had never heard of Khalid Nazari was breaking down a rifle she'd cleaned yesterday and would clean again tomorrow, running numbers through a ballistic model with a pen and a notebook in a room with no windows, building the same patient, unacknowledged capacity that Maya had built before her. Not because anyone had told her it would matter, but because the work itself was the answer to the question of whether it would. The vehicle reached the airfield. Maya got out, shouldered her bag, walked toward the terminal without looking back. She had a program to return to, and a window that, for the first time in 6 years, was beginning to open. The world rarely makes room for people like Maya Reeves on the first try, but the ones who keep building anyway, in silence, without permission, without guarantee, are always the ones the world eventually has no choice but to remember.